It's really a pleasure to bring them to you. Two brilliant author professors, William Taubman, who's sitting right down here, and he'll speak second. Why don't you give a wave? I want to give a shout out to his wife, Jane, who is in the front row also, and a distinguished scholar of Russian studies as well in her own right, both at Amherst. And then in a few minutes, I will call out our first speaker, who is Yuri Slezkine. And I think you'll find that both of our speakers bring a wealth of interesting and deep understanding of their subject. So let me say a word, first of all, about William Taubman. Bill published a book, I think it's about 14 years ago. He seems to specialize in the most important people who undermined Stalin. And his first book was about Khrushchev. And it was an amazing book and an amazing success. It's still available, and you can even purchase it here today, I think. And it won, among other things, the Pulitzer Prize for biography, and I believe it won the National Book Award, or the National Book Critics Award for biography. So having done that, it's a little bit hard to come up with a second act, but I think he's done it. He latched on to still another really giant in Soviet politics, who again worked so hard to change what Stalin had wrought. And of course, that's the subject of his new book and the subject of his talk tonight, and that's Mikhail Gorbachev. So this new book, which is Gorbachev, His Life and Times, is available here. It is getting uniform rave reviews. Let me read you what the New York Times said. They said it was a masterly new biography that will surely stand as the definitive English language chronicle of this most intriguing figure for many years to come. I think it probably would, when they translate it into Russian, it'll be the standard Russian as well. And then joining him, and actually he'll be our first speaker, is Yuri Slezkine. Yuri is a professor of history at the University of California, Berkeley. I may not have given enough emphasis to the fact that both Bill and his wife Jane are at Amherst, and Bill, over the years, specialized in interdisciplinary Russian studies, politics, and history. Yuri is a well-known historian of Russian history, and in addition to his work at Berkeley, he's a fellow of the Hoover Institute at Stanford. Some years ago, I think it was about 2005, he published a book called The Jewish Century, which is an amazing story of the role of Jews, primarily, I think, in the Eastern European countries over a whole century. And like Bill's book, Yuri's book garnered all manner of prizes, including the National Jewish Book Award for the Book of the Year. And so he has a new book also. We're really lucky that two award-winning authors each have published major works on Russia this year. His new book is House of Government, a Saga of the Russian Revolution. And it basically tells the story of some very high-ranking Soviet officials who lived in this important and imposing building in Moscow, only to find that most, if not all of them, end up victims of Stalin purges. So I think you'll do yourself a favor if you get and read both of these. The London Review of Books has described Yuri as a master stylist, and they've described his book as a Soviet War and Peace. So that's pretty high praise. So I'm going to ask you to join me in welcoming and giving a round of applause to both of our speakers, and then I'll invite Yuri to come out and begin our program.
Thank you all for coming. It's great to be here. So between 1928 and about 1932, the Soviet government built a new socialist state, some call it Stalinist, and a fully nationalized economy. And at the same time, it built a house for itself. It was called the House of Government, and it was located in a low-lying area called the Swamp, diagonally across the river from the Kremlin. The largest residential building in Europe at the time. It combined 505 fully furnished apartments with a large number of public spaces, including a cafeteria, theater, movie theater, walk-in clinic, daycare center, kindergarten, tennis court, bank, laundry, post office, a solarium, and a couple dozen rooms for various activities, including painting, chess playing, pool playing, and orchestra rehearsals. Sharing those facilities, raising their families, moving from apartment to keep up with promotions, were people's commissars, which is to say Soviet government ministers, deputy commissars, industrial managers, Red Army commanders, secret police officials, socialist realist writers, and various worthies, including the man who embalmed Lenin's body, the man who wrote the Soviet national anthem, Lenin's secretary, and Stalin's relatives, among others. Stalin himself remained in the Kremlin across the river. So it was the vanguards, and that's what they called themselves, the vanguard of the working class, the vanguard's backyard. A dormitory where top public officials lived as husbands and wives, parents, children, neighbors. A place where revolutionaries came home. And, as I say in the book, the revolution came to die. In the mid-1930s, that's the core of the story, the 1930s. There were about 2,600 registered tenants living in that house. About 700 of them high officials assigned to particular apartments. The rest were their dependents, including about 600 children. And then serving them and maintaining the building as guards and guardians and gardeners and painters and laundresses, floor polishers, and so on were house employees, including about 50 administrators. And then, during the so-called Great Terror, about 800 of them were evicted from the house and accused of degeneracy, duplicity, counter-revolutionary activity, and just general unreliability. They were all found guilty one way or another. Actually not about, 344 people are known to have been executed. And the rest of the 800 were sentenced to various forms of imprisonment. So my book is a history of that building from the time it was conceived in the mid-1920s to the time most of the original residents were expelled from that building, and the building itself stopped being of government and became just a regular high-status building in downtown Moscow. But really, that was the original plan. The more memoirs, letters, diaries, speeches I read, and the more elderly survivors I interviewed, the more convinced I became that the story had to begin earlier. That I had to start in the swamp at the turn of the 20th century, when the future high officials of the Soviet government first converted to socialism and joined the party, the Bolshevik Party. Except that it was not really a party. Not, in other words, an organization committed to taking power within the existing state. It was a sect by most definitions, which is to say a faith-based group in conflict with the world, with voluntary membership contingent on personal conversion and a strong sense of chosenness and ethical austerity. The only condition for joining was unconditional faith in the total destruction of the existing order of things, accompanied by a bloody revenge of the weak on the strong, with the poor inheriting the earth. And to quote from the Internationale, those who used to be nothing becoming everything. And followed in short order by a collective this world, this salvation, leading to a vaguely described state of absolute perfection, at least for the chosen. Now, as in most such sects, the core members were young men who had abandoned their fathers, mothers, wives, children, brothers, sisters, and yes, their own lives, to join a charismatic leader who represented the sect's sacred center. Lenin's nickname was the Old Man. Women made up a very small proportion of the membership and performed important but auxiliary roles as debate audiences, model martyrs, prison liaisons, and poets' muses. One of the top Moscow Bolsheviks, a man by the name of Valerian Osinsky, associated the coming of communism with the day he would become reunited with his secret lover, Anna Shaternikova. Communism, as he described it in his private letters, was a kingdom of eternal love. Over there, he wrote to Shaternikova, love will reveal without shame all of its profound tenderness. One of the top Kazan Bolsheviks, a man, by the way, by the name of Alexander Arosyev, associated the coming of the revolution with transformation of the entire world into an enormous fraternal sect. So communism, as he described it, was a kingdom of universal friendship. His best friend was his high school classmate and violinist by the name of Skryabin. The prophecy came true, as you know. It came true on Easter Monday, 1917, when Lenin rode into Petrograd on the train and proclaimed that the time had come, the prophecy had been fulfilled, and the present generation would not pass away until all these things had happened. As for those socialists who had ears but did not hear, he knew that they were neither hot nor cold, and so, since they were lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, he was going to spit them out of his mouth. Revolutions and sects are for young people. At the time Babylon fell, Osinsky was 30 years old, Anna Shaternikova was 25, and Arosyev and his best friend, Skryabin, who had in the meantime changed his name to Molotov, were 27. The old man was 47 years old. Osinsky moved to Kharkov to be with Anna. and then left her again in order to preside over the so-called war communism, the building of the Soviet economy, in his capacity as the first chairman of the State Bank and the National Council of the National Economy, Supreme Council of the National Economy. Aroshev became one of the leaders of the Bolshevik military insurrection in Moscow, and his best friend Molotov became a member of the Military Revolutionary Committee in Petrograd and one of the leading Bolsheviks in Petrograd after the so-called February Revolution, the fall of the Tsar. Now, the revolution was followed, as some of you may know, by something called the New Economic Policy, which was proclaimed as a retreat and was analogous to what in American historiography is known as the Great Disappointment, when on October the 22nd, 1844, thousands of New Englanders waited for the world to end, realized it hadn't, and as one of them put it, wept and wept until the day dawned. The failure of the prophecy coincided with the prophet's death. Trotsky didn't attend Lenin's funeral because of a mysterious nervous illness. In 1927, 1,300, I think, top Bolsheviks stayed at Lenin Rest Home No. 1 outside Moscow. 6 of them were found to be healthy. 65% of the rest were diagnosed with various forms of emotional distress, described as neurasthenia or psychic neurasthenia or emotional exhaustion. One public prosecutor who couldn't stop crying for several months after Lenin's death was treated for traumatic neurosis, which he, in his desperate pleas for help to the Society of the Old Bolsheviks, called nervosis. Now, the surviving old Bolsheviks moved into the Kremlin or several downtown Moscow hotels that had been converted into dorms known as houses of Soviets, and settled into a busy, boisterous, promiscuous, but also self-doubting and self-loathing communal domesticity, visiting each other's apartments, drinking hot and strong tea, smoking cheap cigarettes, having sex, arguing about historical necessity, running the world revolution, and weeping and weeping. Soviet literature, official Soviet Bolshevik literature of the 1920s consisted of sort of gothic tales about communist maidens being pursued by vampires in dorms that look like medieval castles, or more often of Bolshevik men being held prisoner by fleshy females, presiding over the suffocating world of lace curtains, orange lampshades, furry slippers, soft pillows, and I quote, rubber plants, porcelain cats, not all of them soft, porcelain cats, and so on. One of the most prominent representative of that particular literary trend was Alexander Aroshev, Molotov's friend, who believed in eventual universal friendship. It was at about that time that many top Bolsheviks left their old female comrades for younger women, most of them recent recruits to proliferating secretariats and commissariats of the ever-expanding Soviet state. The party's ideologue, Bukharin, married the daughter of his best friend. The chairman of the Committee for the Settlement of Jewish Toilers on the Land married his adopted daughter, and the chairman of the, Semyon Diamantstein was his name, and the chairman of the military board of the Soviet Supreme Court married the daughter of his own wife. he just one day moved out of the mother's room and into the daughter's. They continued to share the same apartment, and one of the offspring of this new union was the great Soviet writer Yuri Trifonov, whose novella, The House on the Embankment, was my inspiration for writing this book. He was born in 1925, which was the lowest point in the history of Soviet great disappointment, and perhaps not surprisingly the highest in number of births among communist officials. Now, Asinsky finally left his wife and son to be with Anna, and then left Anna to return to his wife and son. Anna married someone else and had a son whom she named Vsimir, meaning worldwide, for worldwide revolution. And then several years later, Asinsky and Anna ran into each other at an official reception. She fainted, was taken to a hospital, somehow lost her party card, and Asinsky, as one of her original recommenders, was called upon to reconfirm his endorsement. They met again and resumed their relationship. Aroshev got married, had 3 daughters, but soon thereafter, soon after the birth of the 3rd daughter, his wife left him for another party official who had abandoned his wife and 3 children in order to be with her. Aroshev was then sent to Prague as Soviet ambassador to Czechoslovakia and soon married his elder daughter's dance teacher, a German Jewish woman by the name of Gertrude, or Gera, whom his daughters loved to hate. And then the day dawned. That's if you remember how I began. Between 1928 and about 1932, the Soviet government built a new socialist state, a fully nationalized economy, and at the same time, it built a house for itself, the House of Government. The House of Government was classified as a building of the transitional type, halfway between full-fledged communalism based explicitly on monasteries and bourgeois housing organized around family apartments. It was a compromise. Now, early Soviet communalism was about interchangeable individuals living transparent lives in elastic public buildings. The question really was whether individual cells would be attached to long corridors in multi-story public buildings, communal buildings, or to endless roads traversing this sort of newly decentered landscape, or not attached to anything at all. Some people envisioned floating and flying individual dwellings with each human being behaving, as one ideologue put it, like a snail carrying its own shell. So Soviet collectivism consisted of individuals, and bourgeois individualism resided in families. The point was a leap from the latter to the former, from what they call the kingdom of necessity into the kingdom of freedom. The success of that transformation was contingent on the final solution to the problem of love and family. Really, the key problem for any sectarian community. And in this case, the question was whether it was possible to build communism and live in families at the same time. In the meantime, the House of Government was a compromise combining 505 fully furnished apartments and all those public buildings public spaces that virtually no one used, except for the children. Some Critics actually argued that the House of Government was functionally similar to the Dakota building in New York City. But they realized their mistake as soon as socialism, or rather the economic foundations of socialism, had been built. And that's what Stalin proclaimed at the end of the first five-year plan. The economic foundations had been built, and the 1930s were ultimately about the sort of confident expectation of the inevitable. The Soviet post-St. Augustine age. As the writer Isaac Babel said at the first Congress of Soviet Writers, the first layer of scaffolding has been taken down from the house of socialism. Only the most nearsighted people fail to see its beauty. We are all witnesses to the fact that the Soviet people have been gripped by a powerful feeling of pure physical joy. And that's why the top Soviet officials and their new families moved into their new building. When they did, most of the men were in their 40s, early 50s. Most of the women were in their early 30s. Most of the children were between the ages of 5 and 10. And most of the maids, and each family had one, were young peasant women in their early 20s. Refugees from famine-gripped farms that their masters had recently collectivized. Now the apartment geography reflected the family hierarchy. The symbolic center of every apartment and the largest room was father's study, with walls covered with dark oak bookcases from floor to ceiling. And most of the books mentioned are the massive gold-lettered editions of the Broghaus and Ephron Encyclopedia, the Treasures of World Literature series from academia publishers, and collected works by various great writers, Dickens foremost among them. So to conclude, the building was transitional also in another sense, in that it was part neoclassical, particularly the facade facing the river, and part constructivist avant-garde, particularly the apartments themselves. And people did their best to make it less dry by bringing in old beds and chests and desks and putting up photographs and paintings and swords and putting down carpets and rugs and so on. Men fairly early on switched from leather jackets to suits. Women, as one of them put it, suddenly discovered that they were beautiful. Many of them had new dresses made by government seamstresses. They drew the line at curtains as the ultimate symbol of bourgeois domesticity, and for women at lipstick, which was seen as a symbol of bourgeois eroticism. But no one knew what to do about it, and what kind of eroticism was not bourgeois, and what kind of domesticity was socialist. And the reason for that is that Marxism had a very flat conception of human nature, so that a revolution in property relations was the only necessary precondition for a revolution in human hearts. Really no one in the house, living in that house, knew what a good socialist family was supposed to look like, what a good socialist father or mother was supposed to be like. And everyone was gripped by this powerful feeling of pure physical joy and by the equally powerful feeling of confusion and guilt at the same time. Arosев Asinsky kept writing to Anna but less and less frequently. Arosев kept seeing Molotov, but less and less frequently. He blamed his wife for the rising swamp of domesticity surrounding them, and blamed Molotov's wife, the head of the Soviet perfume and cosmetics industry, for the collapse of their friendship. And then finally, night came and the knock on the door, the Great Terror, which was a moral panic and a witch hunt engineered and suffered by most millenarian sects. In February 1937, Asinsky wrote his last letter to Anna, saying the question of when will the day come has been replaced by the question of who is to blame for its not arriving. And the only solution, he wrote, was to stop talking altogether. He was arrested in October and shot a year later. Arosев was on vacation with his wife Gera, their newborn son, and one of his daughters when the knock came. And so just one last passage I will read to you. According to his daughter, she describes, to everyone's surprise, they came for Gera, not for Arosев. He says, my father and Gera began to say goodbye. They stood huddled against each other. They were not embracing, but just stood there, not moving. Maybe they were silently telling each other something, or perhaps promising, I don't know. They were saying goodbye. Suddenly Gera started and turned to walk to the bedroom to say goodbye to her son. She stopped and looked back, and I saw her face. I will never forget the look on her face as long as I live. It was pure, indescribable agony. She said softly in German, no, I cannot do it. Lord, why do they send me such trials? The two came up on either side and led her away, already under arrest. Arosев and the children went back to the House of Government, and he kept calling Molotov. And whoever picked up the receiver wouldn't talk, hang up, or just breathe into the receiver. And Arosев kept saying Vyacha, which was Molotov's childhood nickname. Please say something, please tell me what to do. And finally, according to one of his daughters, Arosев heard Molotov's voice say, make sure the children are taken care of. And when I was doing research in Moscow, I found Arosev's last letter to Molotov, a desperate plea for help and for an explanation. And across the page, in Molotov's hand, big block red letters, the resolution said, to the archive. And that's where I found it. Thank you.
Having read and enjoyed Yuri's wonderful book, I wanted to try to connect the two books as a way of transitioning to my biography of Gorbachev. And I thought of two things. One, at one point in Yuri's book, he says, it's often said that revolutions kill their children, but in fact what happened was the children of the revolutionaries killed the revolution. That is, the children who grew up in the House of Government and later, when they grew up, became supporters of the great change in the Soviet Union that Mikhail Gorbachev tried to carry out. And indeed, Gorbachev himself was born in 1931, which puts him roughly contemporaneous with a lot of the children of the people who lived in the House of Government. But of course, the difference, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment, is that he was not a child of that House of Government or of any of the revolutionaries or the elite. He was a peasant boy born in a village in southern Russia. The other thing I thought of listening to Yuri just now was the contrast between the sexual promiscuity of the revolutionaries living in the House of Government and Gorbachev's lifelong devotion to his wife, Raisa Gorbacheva, which was both one of the most admirable things about him and also part of his tragedy in the end, which I'll get to in a moment. Gorbachev destroyed communism, as you know, not entirely by himself, but he was the main one who did it, Soviet communism. He, more than anyone else, including Ronald Reagan, ended the Cold War. We could talk about that if you'd like to. He presided unintentionally over the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in that sense, he changed his country and the world, although neither as much as he wished. One reason he could do all of these things was he had the tremendous power that came from being the leader of a still totalitarian, or shall we call it post-totalitarian state. The leaders of that state had more power than American presidents, more power than leaders of democracy, in which presidents, at least most of the time, are more constrained. No comment. Another interesting thing and a very important thing about Gorbachev is that he was unique in the sense that no one else in the Soviet leadership at his time would have done what he did. The Politburo of the Communist Party had about 15 members in it. Only 3 of them supported him almost until the end. Yakovlev, Shevardnadze, and another guy named Vadim Medvedev. But they were only in a position to support him almost to the end, not quite to the end, because he had put them there or kept them there. In other words, he did what others in his position, who had actually chosen him to be their leader, would not have done in his place. And the interesting thing about that is that it is an invitation to us, or to me as his biographer, to try to understand his character. Because if a leader does something unique or acts in a unique way rather than the way others might in his case, in his place, because they share the values or because they face a situation which dictates an outcome to anyone who faces it, if he is unique, as Gorbachev was, then this suggests that some of what he does reflects his character, his personality, internal drives, compulsions, whatever it is that motivates us. So that takes us back to biography, which is what my book is, but it's the case that I make that this is a biography with a special mission to explain the behavior of a man who changed his country and the world, although not as much as he would have wished. Now, my book addresses several big questions. I'm going to name them, and then I'm going to provide, as best I can, as quickly as I can, a very, very thumbnail answer, in the thought that if you're interested in some of these issues, we could return to them during question and answer session, or, radical as that thought may be, that you might read my book. My publisher would be particularly pleased if that were the outcome. Okay, the first question is, how did Gorbachev become Gorbachev? That is, how did a peasant boy growing up in a peasant village who won a high school prize for a high-flown essay praising Stalin become the man who destroyed Soviet communism in the end? A second question is, how did a man who would destroy communism, how was he chosen to be the leader of the communist regime? How could that possibly be? A third question, which I tried to answer, is what were his original aims when he took over in March 1985 as the Soviet leader? He said at the time, and he says in retrospect, that he initially favored only relatively modest economic reforms. And if you look at those reforms, they were indeed very modest. But he ended up trying to democratize a country which, for its centuries of existence, or its predecessor country, the Russia and its empire, and then the Soviet Union, had known only authoritarian and then totalitarian rule. He imagined moving this from a command economy into a market economy. He imagined and tried in the end to change it from a phony federation into a genuine federation. And he also imagined not only ending the Cold War, but trying to create a new world order which would be characterized as much as possible by the renunciation of violence and the use of force. And just to name these things that in the end he seemed to be trying to do is to ask another one of my questions, which is, how could he possibly imagine succeeding in such a gargantuan task, in such a country which in so many ways was not prepared for anything like this? Well, as we know, he didn't quite make it. Forced out of power in December 1991, the Soviet Union at that point was on the verge of collapse. It went out of existence on the very day he left office, and in due course, after 10 more or less chaotic years under President Yeltsin, it came into the possession of Vladimir Putin, who has in many, but not all ways, reversed course back to something like an authoritarian regime. So another question of mine was, how did Gorbachev react to the failure, if that's what it was? Did he see it that way, of his own project when it ended in this way? Okay, now here comes my thumbnail attempt to summarize very quickly answers to these questions. How did Gorbachev become Gorbachev? Well, I devote a chapter to his childhood in southern Russia, the area north of the Caucasus. And what I come away with is that he lived in terrible times, that's obvious, born in 1931, famine, collectivization, the purges, the war. His village was occupied for 4 months by the Nazis. He lived in terrible times, but he emerged, as he said, we were poor, practically beggars, but I felt wonderful. And that line, when I discovered it, confirmed what I had figured out, or thought I had figured out for myself. He'd had a wonderful father. There's a picture of his father in my book, and he has smiling, kind eyes. He had a wonderful grandfather who loved him. Neither one of these peasant patriarchs tried to dominate him and tell him what to do. He had a much harsher mother, and I won't go into that lest I be accused of reducing everything to the way this great man was treated by his mother. That is not the case, but it's a very interesting counter element in his life. But from all of this, I try to argue he emerged with a sense of optimism and confidence and self-confidence and trust in people. Imagine emerging from the 1930s with that kind of trust, which is, I think, necessary for imagining what he imagined, the kind of great change he was going to carry out in his country. He went to Moscow University, the elite university of the Soviet Union, from 1950 to 55. And here, in my thumbnail sketch, what I want to say is that Moscow University contributed, as most universities do, and we've probably all experienced it ourselves, to doubts and questioning. There were professors at Moscow University at his time who'd been trained before the revolution or in the 1920s. They didn't dare say entirely what was on their mind, but they could hint. And he had wonderful fellow students, two of whom shaped his life. One of them was a Czech student named Zdeněk Mlynář, who in 1968 became the chief ideologist of the Prague Spring under Alexander Dubček. And it turns out that Mlynář was Gorbachev's best friend during his university years. Now, Mlynář at that time had not become quite the Prague Spring himself, but you learn from reading about him and his memoirs and Gorbachev and talking to Gorbachev, as Jane and I did on many occasions, that these people were already beginning to be emancipated from the kind of indoctrination that had led Gorbachev to praise Stalin so highly in his high school speech. The other woman he met at Moscow, the other person he met at Moscow University was his wife, the woman he married in 1953, Raisa Titarenko, Raisa Gorbacheva, whom he dearly loved. And unlike a lot of politicians in a lot of countries, he was faithful to her. Unlike a lot of politicians in a lot of countries, especially, I guess, the Soviet Union, he was not only a loving father, but a devoted, loving husband, but a devoted father and grandfather to his daughter and granddaughters. And I try in the book to talk about the role that his wife played in his life and also Mlynář. Gorbachev climbed the ladder, the Communist Party ladder, the greased pole, as it were, in the provinces from 1955 to 1978 when he moved to Moscow. And there are lots of things that I could say about that. I try to say them in the book. But my summary is that he was honest, incorruptible, better educated than most, in a way, he reminds me of what one read about the way communism imagined the new Soviet man. As I say, educated, enlightened, incorruptible, devoted husband, father. He was a good man, a decent man. You can feel that when you interview him, as Jane and I did 8 times over the 10 years. His decency, in a way, helps to explain his high ideals, and his decency helps to explain the trouble he got into. He hated the use of force, although he used it a couple of times. But there are a lot of people, including many of his former associates, who thought he should have been much tougher. There was one liberal-minded aide we interviewed who said, with regard to Gorbachev's unwillingness to use force when the Azerbaijanis and the Armenians clashed over Nagorno-Karabakh, that disputed territory between them, and Gorbachev insisted on searching for a political solution, and this aide said he should have hung 15 or 20 of them from lampposts, because if he had, then the other separatist nationalities, the Balts and others, would have hesitated to push on toward independence in the way that he did. But these virtues of his turned out, ironically and importantly, to be virtues in the eyes of his bosses, including the most important man about whom later Raisa said that he was the one who helped him become the leader, Yuri Andropov. Remember him? He was the police chief for a good long time in the 70s, and he put dissidents into mental hospitals. He wasn't as brutal as Beria and Stalin, but he did a lot of pretty horrible things. It turns out, however, that Andropov was a man from humble origins who aspired in his own way to be an intellectual. And he took to Gorbachev. I interviewed a man named Bogomolov, who'd been the head of an institute in Moscow and had been an aide to Andropov in the 1960s when Andropov was not yet the head of the KGB. And Bogomolov and his young colleagues used to find books like Montaigne and other classics on Andropov's desk. And one day Bogomolov said to him, "Why do you have these books on your desk?" And the answer was, "So as to be able to converse with you guys, you younger, more intellectual, better educated aides." Well, Andropov thought Gorbachev was wonderful. An element of luck entered into it. They met because Gorbachev was the province leader of a province which included some lovely resorts in the North Caucasus, where Andropov, who also hailed from that area, liked to vacation. And when he came down to vacation, Gorbachev was his host, and they hung out together. I have a picture in the book in which Andropov is standing there with a camera, taking a picture of Gorbachev and his wife who are sitting on a rock in the mountains. And they would go out and camp out and sing songs together, sometimes by dissident bards, and cook shashlik and talk all night. And so when Andropov came back, when Andropov was appointed first secretary of the Central Committee after his stint in the KGB and then party leader upon Brezhnev's death, he promoted Gorbachev. Now there's one more step. Gorbachev has to become the top leader, the most important leader of all, and he does in 1985. Why did that happen? Well, for many reasons, but part of it was that there wasn't much competition. There were only 2 young men in the Politburo, young meaning 53 or 4. The other one was the Leningrad party leader with the wonderful Russian name Romanov, not a relative of the Tsar's, rather something of a drunkard. It wasn't a hard choice, and in fact, they come to the conclusion that considering the competition and considering the fact that his 3 predecessors, Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko, were dead men walking, in effect, very sick, soon to die, Gorbachev's problem was not that they were hard acts to follow, but that they were too easy. That is, I think this contributed to his sense that once he became the leader and started to change the country, it would go much more easily and smoothly than it turned out to. So he became the leader, and you know what happened after that. Things began to deteriorate after he switched from modest economic reform to mostly free elections, a genuinely functioning parliament, glasnost, which verged on pretty quickly on free speech. And by 1990, the country was beginning to come apart, and I have a chapter in which I ponder the question of whether Gorbachev himself was coming apart at the same time. And the evidence is mixed. Some of his close aides describe him in a way that is appalling, as if they don't understand why he is not speaking as coherently as he used to and listening as closely as he used to aides, and they worry that he is indeed coming apart. But others, like his wife, insist that he's not. And in the meantime, his relations with the outside world have gone from being doubted at first and then being embraced by somebody like Ronald Reagan. That's another puzzle I tried to figure out. How could it be that this communist leader and this arch-American president could become the bosom buddies that they really did? And I attribute it in the end to personal chemistry more than anything else. I can talk about that if you'd like. And then his relations with George Bush, who becomes even warmer in the end toward Gorbachev, but who does him a distinct disservice in 1989. Bush becomes president, is inaugurated. Reagan has vouched for Gorbachev, and Bush declares a pause to reassess whether Gorbachev deserves the respect and affection that Reagan has shown for him. And months go by before the United States warms up to Gorbachev, at the very moment when I think, in retrospect, Gorbachev could have benefited greatly from the support of the United States. Well, in the end, and I'm coming to the end, I describe Gorbachev as a tragic hero. A hero because of what he attempted, tragic because of the way it didn't work out, but also tragic because of why it didn't work out. And I attribute that in large part to the multiple obstacles he faced: resistance from communist hardliners, resistance from radical Democrats who thought he was going too slow and wanted to go fast, resistance from Boris Yeltsin, who Gorbachev humiliated, and then who humiliated Gorbachev in turn before finishing him off, and the Soviet Union as well. But I also think Gorbachev's own fatal flaws contributed to the final outcome. And those fatal flaws, interestingly enough, consisted in some of the same characteristics which I think I identified the start of when he was a child. And he himself agrees, but not entirely. One of them was he was too confident, too sure of himself, too certain that he could prevail in a situation as hostile to his promises and preferences. He was also too trusting of the hardliners whom he tried to bring along. It wasn't that he idealized them at all. He knew they were pretty nasty. And in fact, at one point, when one of his close aides, whom we got to know very well too, Anatoly Chernyayev, tried to get Gorbachev to break with the Communist Party and told him, look, join with Yeltsin, join with the Democrats, leave them behind. And Gorbachev said, I can't do that. They are a rabid dog on a leash, and I can't let that leash go. So he kept them with him until they tried to oust him in the August 1991 coup. And he trusted, it wasn't so much that he trusted Boris Yeltsin, but he was too confident that he, Gorbachev, could prevail over Yeltsin. And I have some interesting evidence of that, except it turned out it was Yeltsin who prevailed over him. On the eve of that August 1991 coup, which really finished him off, even though he wasn't ousted from power until December, he was warned by many people that there was a coup coming. And one of the warnings came from the United States, from Ambassador Jack Matlock, who told him in his office that the United States had information to the effect that there was going to be a coup. And Gorbachev said, no. And later on, he explained to Chernyayev that the reason was that the people who had been said to be plotting against him needed him more than he needed them, and without him, they would be nothing. So those are examples of some of the flaws. These are examples from his life. And to go back to what I said in the beginning, there's a famous quote from the British historian Thomas Carlyle that history is the biography of great men. Most of us wouldn't accept that anymore. First of all, the word men, and secondly, the overemphasis on the importance of individual leaders. and their biographies. But this is a case in which the biography of Gorbachev helps to explain the fate of the Soviet Union and of the world. Thank you.
You know, we have Khrushchev. Khrushchev left in a coup. Who was driven in power, you know, against his will. He was a villager, just like Gorbachev. Do you think the reason the Russian somehow elected Gorbachev because they thought that he will become another Khrushchev?
Well, Gorbachev became far more than another Khrushchev. He went much farther than Khrushchev. And because he was going farther than Khrushchev, and because he knew very well what had happened to Khrushchev, who was ousted in October 1964, he was worried from the word go about being ousted. In fact, that's why he kept the hardliners so close to him, so that they wouldn't move against him. And many would say that was a fatal mistake, that he should have broken with them. We interviewed, Jane and I, Alexander Yakovlev in Moscow, and for the first half of the interview, that's what Yakovlev said. He said Gorbachev should have kicked them out. They were afraid of him. He was the Soviet leader. They would have gone whimpering. It would have been easy. But later in the same interview, Yakovlev started to say, well, of course you had to be cautious. And this, I think, expressed the complexity of the situation that Gorbachev faced. He was constrained by these hardliners. He was fearful of them. He was tempted to get rid of them, but he was afraid to move against them, and in the end they moved against him.
Yeah, gentleman right there.
How does Gorbachev feel about Putin and his obvious contempt for what Gorbachev did and the way Putin is moving the country?
I think that question was about Putin, right? About what the
Yeah.
By the way,
Well, how does Gorbachev feel about
how does
the way
Gorbachev
Putin has
feel about
moved the
Putin?
country?
Gorbachev has a somewhat strange, to me, attitude toward Putin. In the year 2000, when Putin was elected president after being appointed acting president by Yeltsin, Gorbachev supported him in that election. Gorbachev said afterwards that a certain amount of authoritarianism was necessary in Russia after the chaos, as he regarded it, of the Yeltsin years. Ever since then, Gorbachev has been more and more disenchanted with Putin. He opposed his re-election in 2012, and yet he continues to find reasons to praise him from time to time. And most recently, in April 2017, he was asked by a German newspaper, do you still trust Putin? And Gorbachev said, yes, I do. And Gorbachev has even gone so far as to say, this man who tried to democratize the Soviet Union in 5 years, that the process of democratizing Russia may take decades. And at one point he said about 10 years ago, it may take the entire 21st century. And here, if I may, I'd be tempted to ask my colleague, Yuri, who is a real Russia historian, whereas I am actually a political scientist, pretending to be a historian or biographer. What do you think, Yuri, about the prospects, given its history, of Russia becoming a democracy? That's a bad question to ask a historian.
Introduce a question like that by calling someone a historian. I have no idea. I rather doubt it.
You're pessimistic.
Well, I would be pessimistic if I were against authoritarianism.
Say that again? You would be...
I'm assuming that Gorbachev read the book at some point.
Assuming what?
I'm interested in Gorbachev's reaction to the book. Did he read it? Did he read an early copy? Have you communicated with him since he's had access to the book?
Gorbachev does not read English. I presented him with a copy of my Khrushchev biography in English at one point in my quest to obtain his cooperation in working on his biography. But he only read it once there was a Russian translation. And a couple of years later, quaking in my boots, I heard him say, as he grabbed my arm, "It's a good work, very solid," which is characteristic of Gorbachev and perhaps another one of his flaws. Not that he didn't praise my book, but because he doesn't like to praise other people. In fact, he doesn't even always like to thank other people, and a lot of them turned out to complain about that. In this case, I sent him a copy of the book, and I heard back indirectly. He said, "Благодарю от души." I thank you from my soul, my heart. And once I've read the Russian translation, I'll give you my впечатления, my impressions. So now I can wait quaking in my shoes again to hear his impressions.
I studied in Berlin in 1961-62, and I'm absolutely amazed at the changes that have taken place since that time. The reunification of Germany, the foundation of the European Union, amazing. And I feel Gorbachev is a hero in that. And I feel he's little recognized in the United States. We seem to believe that Ronald Reagan said a few words in front of the wall and that did it. So I really want to thank you for this book. And I wonder, to me, it looks like history was changed in a major, major way. And I wonder if you see it that way?
I have a shorthand way of assessing the importance of Reagan and Gorbachev when it came to ending the Cold War. And that is to say, if there had been no Gorbachev, this is counterfactual history, which is another sin of a non-historian, I know. If there had been no Gorbachev, the Cold War would have continued, because Reagan would have been dealing with one of the relative troglodytes of the Politburo, and it wouldn't have ended. On the other hand, had there been Gorbachev but no Reagan, the Cold War would have ended, because Bush, let's say, instead of Reagan, would have joined eventually with Gorbachev in the way that he did to end the Cold War. So that, I'm sure, is, I keep looking over at my historian colleague, looking at the quizzical look in the corner of his eye, but that's my sense of the relative credit due to Gorbachev and Reagan, but they both certainly cooperated in a way that it was extraordinary and unexpected.
Yuri, did you want to add to that in any way?
Well, I certainly agree that Gorbachev, Gorbachev did something that none of his peers from the Politburo would have done at the same time. But I think it's no accident that the old regime ended with the death of the last representative of a particular generation.
The death of whom, sorry? The death of whom?
Of the last representative of a particular generation of Soviet leaders. When Chernenko died, probably before he was actually pronounced dead, much of the regime, I think, died with him. And so Gorbachev was tremendously important in, I think, the way the country unraveled. But my sense, for what it's worth, because it's all counterfactual, is that the system installed during the first 5-year plan that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk came to an end when the last communist in power died.
And there we leave it this evening. Please join me in thanking Yuri Slezkine and Bill Taubman.